The rain hammered against the glass walls of the Manhattan law office as Opal Black signed away $3 million without blinking. Julian Mercer leaned back in his chair beside his attorney, smiling like a man watching someone destroy herself. His mother actually laughed under her breath. "All this," Julian said, tapping the settlement papers, "and you want to keep a dusty storage box?" Opal slid the pen down carefully. Her fingers trembled, but her voice didn't. "Yes." Julian smirked and signed immediately. He thought she was clinging to memories. What he didn't know was that the box contained the one thing capable of destroying everything he built. And by the time he realized it, it would already be too late. If you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or made to feel invisible by someone who only valued you when they needed you, this story is for you. Comment below. What would you have taken? In Opal's place, the money or the truth? The first apartment Opal Black and Julian Mercer ever shared smelled like burnt coffee printer ink and cheap laundry detergent. It was tiny. One bedroom, cracked windows, a radiator that screamed through Boston winters like it was dying slowly inside the walls. But back then Opal had loved it because Julian had loved it. Because back then Julian had loved her. At 26, Opal worked 12-hour shifts as a systems architect for a logistics software company, while Julian struggled through business school with more ambition than direction. He used to sit at their chipped kitchen table at 2 in the morning, exhausted and frustrated, loosening his tie while stacks of unpaid bills sat between them. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted one night quietly. Opal looked up from her laptop. Her eyes were tired, but warm. "Yes, you can." Julian laughed bitterly. "You always say that, because it's true." He stared at her for a long moment before asking, "Why do you believe in me this much?" Opal smiled softly. "Because one day," she said, "you're going to build something incredible." Years later, she would realize the tragedy wasn't that Julian failed her. It was that she had once loved him enough to build him with her own hands. Back then, Julian wasn't arrogant. He wasn't cruel. He was insecure, hungry, desperate to matter. And Opal made him feel like he already did. She paid most of the rent while he finished school. She edited his presentations, helped him rehearse investor pitches, corrected spreadsheets at midnight while eating instant noodles beside him on the floor because they couldn't afford chairs yet. When Julian first talked about launching his own company, he was terrified. What if nobody invests? They will. What if the platform fails? Then we fix it. What if I fail? Opal reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then I fail with you. That sentence would haunt her years later. Because she had. The original framework for Mercer Analytics started in one of Opal's notebooks. Not Julian's. Julian had the charisma, the networking skills, the confidence in public rooms. But Opal built systems the way musicians composed symphonies. She could see patterns other people missed. Structures, scalability, operational flow. Julian used to call her his secret weapon. "You know what your problem is?" he teased once while watching her code late into the night. You're smarter than everyone in the room, and somehow still don't know it." Opal laughed. "I don't need to be the smartest person in the room." "No," Julian said, kissing her forehead. "But I do." The first time investors showed serious interest in the company, Julian cried in the hallway after the meeting. Actually, cried. Opal remembered holding him against her chest while he whispered shakily, "We're really going to make it." We. That word disappeared from Julian's vocabulary, the richer he became. 10 years later, Opal stood alone in a $14 million Connecticut mansion, staring at a dining table large enough to seat 20 people. And she had never felt lonelier in her life. The house was silent except for the faint hum of recessed lighting. Julian was in Chicago for another conference. At least that was what his assistant claimed. Opal walked through the marble kitchen slowly, barefoot, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched. The massive windows overlooked snow-covered trees glowing under landscape lights. Everything looked beautiful. Everything felt dead. She used to think success would make Julian softer. Instead, it sharpened all the worst parts of him. The wealth changed his posture first, then his voice, then the way he looked at people, especially her. At some point, Opal stopped being his partner and became part of the furniture inside his carefully curated life. A beautiful, quiet thing that supported the image, nothing more. You should wear something less conservative, Julian had told her before a corporate gala 3 months earlier. You dress older than you are. Another time, you used to be more interesting. And another, Sabrina actually understands business strategy. You should talk to her sometime. Sabrina Veil. Even hearing the name now made something cold twist inside Opal's stomach. At first, Sabrina had just been another executive strategist at Julian's company. Young, brilliant, polished. The kind of woman who looked expensive, even in black turtlenecks and minimal makeup. Julian talked about her constantly, too constantly. She closed the Denver deal in 48 hours. Sabrina saved us millions during negotiations. Sabrina actually understands pressure. Eventually, Opal stopped asking questions. Not because she trusted him, because she was afraid of the answer. The front door opened suddenly. Julian stepped inside, removing his coat while talking into his Bluetooth headset. No move, the acquisition call to Thursday, he said coldly. I don't care if they're unhappy. He barely looked at Opal. Call me back in 20. He ended the call and loosened his tie. You're home early, Opal said carefully. Julian walked straight to the kitchen island. It's my house. The words hit harder than they should have. Mine. Not ours. Never ours anymore. Opal watched him pour himself bourbon without asking if she wanted anything. There had once been a version of Julian who memorized her coffee order. Now he barely noticed whether she was in the room. How was Chicago? She asked quietly. Fine. That's it. Julian sighed dramatically, like conversation itself exhausted him. What exactly do you want from me, Opal? She stared at him. The cruelest part was that she genuinely didn't know anymore. Love, attention, basic kindness. She wasn't even asking for loyalty anymore. Just acknowledgement. I made reservations Friday, she said softly. For our anniversary. Julian froze for half a second before taking a drink. I can't. Opal blinked slowly. You can't. I have meetings. You had meetings last anniversary too. And the silence afterward hurt more than shouting would have. Julian rubbed his forehead impatiently. You know what your problem is, he muttered. You live in the past. Opal almost laughed at the irony. The man who built his entire empire on foundations she created was accusing her of living in the past. I supported you through everything, she whispered. Julian's expression hardened instantly. There it is. What? The martyr routine? Opal stared at him in disbelief. You think this is a routine? I think you enjoy acting like you sacrificed everything for me. I did sacrifice everything for you. Julian gave a cold, humorless smile. No one asked you to. That sentence cracked something inside her so quietly she wasn't sure anyone else would have heard it. But she felt it. Deep. Permanent. Julian walked upstairs without another word, leaving Opal standing alone in the kitchen beside untouched wine and 30 years of emotional exhaustion. An hour later, while cleaning the counter absent-mindedly, Opal noticed a folded receipt partially sticking out of Julian's coat pocket. She normally would not have looked. Normally. But something inside her had become too tired to keep protecting illusions. She unfolded the paper slowly. The Crescent Hotel, penthouse suite, champagne service, diamond bracelet. Total $18,740. Opal stared at the receipt, while her heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. That was the strange thing about betrayal. Sometimes your soul knows long before your mind is ready to admit it. Upstairs, Julian laughed softly during another phone call. Not with her. Never with her anymore. Opal folded the receipt carefully, and for the first time in years, she stopped wondering how to save her marriage. Instead, she started wondering who her husband really was. Opal Black did not cry the night she found the receipt. That was the part that frightened her most. Not the hotel, not the bracelet, not even the quiet certainty spreading through her chest like cold water beneath ice. It was the absence of surprise. As if some exhausted part of her had already accepted the truth long ago and was simply waiting for her heart to catch up. 3 days later, Julian told her he had another overnight business trip in Manhattan. He barely looked up from his phone while saying it. Board meetings, he muttered. Opal stood near the staircase holding a cup of coffee she no longer wanted. What hotel? Julian paused, just briefly. The Whitmore. The lie came too quickly. Opal smiled faintly. Okay. Julian nodded once and walked toward the front door. No kiss goodbye. No I'll miss you. Just the sound of expensive shoes crossing marble floors. The moment the front door closed, Opal stood perfectly still inside the silent mansion. Then she walked upstairs, opened her closet and changed clothes. If someone had asked her what she intended to do, she wouldn't have known how to answer. Maybe she still wanted to be wrong. Maybe she needed proof before her soul could finally let go. Or maybe pain simply becomes unbearable when uncertainty keeps feeding it. 2 hours later, Opal sat alone inside a black town car outside the Crescent Hotel in Manhattan. The same hotel from the receipt. Rain slid across the windows in silver streaks, while the city glowed around her in blurred gold and white lights. Couples hurried beneath umbrellas. Valets opened doors. Laughter spilled from expensive restaurants nearby. The world kept moving, even while hers quietly cracked apart. "Ma'am," the driver asked gently, "do you still want me to wait?" Opal looked up at the towering luxury hotel entrance. Yes. Her voice barely sounded like her own. At 8:17 p.m., Julian Mercer stepped out of a black SUV. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect public mask, and smiling. Not the polite corporate smile he gave investors. Not the controlled expression he wore around family. A real smile. Warm, relaxed, alive. Opal hadn't seen that smile directed at her in years. Then Sabrina Vale stepped out behind him. Tall, elegant, dark hair falling in soft waves over a cream-colored coat, and around her wrist, the diamond bracelet. Opal physically stopped breathing for a second. Julian touched Sabrina's lower back as they walked inside together. The gesture was intimate, in the worst possible way. Not sexual, not rushed. Comfortable, practiced, like they belonged to each other. The driver glanced nervously into the rearview mirror. "Ma'am?" "I'm okay," Opal whispered automatically. But she wasn't, not even close. Still, she opened the door and stepped out into the cold Manhattan rain. The lobby of the Crescent Hotel smelled like white roses and polished marble. Everything gleamed softly beneath golden chandelier light. Wealth lived differently in places like this. Quiet, elegant, merciless. Opal stayed far enough behind not to be seen. Julian and Sabrina entered the hotel bar together, laughing softly. Opal followed. Every step felt unreal, like she was watching another woman's marriage collapse from outside her body. The bar overlooked the city skyline through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Piano music floated softly through the room. Julian and Sabrina sat near the corner. Close. Too close. The waitress brought champagne without them ordering, meaning this wasn't their first time here. Something inside Opal folded inward. She sat several tables away, partially hidden behind a column, hands trembling around untouched water. And then she listened. "You were right about the acquisition," Sabrina said smoothly. "Daniel Reed is practically begging for this deal now." Julian smirked. "He'll get it." "And your wife?" Julian leaned back lazily. Opal held her breath. "What about her?" Sabrina tilted her head slightly. "She still doesn't know?" Julian laughed softly. That sound nearly destroyed her. "No. Opal still thinks people stay married because they love each other." The cruelty of it stunned her motionless. Sabrina swirled champagne in her glass. "She seems sweet. She's predictable. Predictable. 15 years together, reduced to one dismissive word." Opal stared at Julian's face, desperately searching for traces of the man she used to love. But that version of him felt gone. Or maybe he had never existed at all. Sabrina leaned closer. "Do you feel guilty?" Julian didn't even hesitate. "No." The answer landed harder than the affair itself, because betrayal was one thing, but complete emotional indifference, that was another kind of death entirely. Julian loosened his tie slightly and glanced toward the skyline. "Opal was useful when I was building everything," he said calmly. "But people outgrow each other." Useful. The word hollowed her out. Sabrina smiled slowly. And now Julian looked directly at her. "Now I want someone who understands the world I live in." Opal felt heat rise behind her eyes for the first time all night. Not because Sabrina was younger, not because Julian cheated, but because she suddenly realized something devastating. Julian genuinely believed she was beneath him now. As if the woman who helped build his empire had somehow become unworthy of standing inside it. Sabrina reached for his hand. "What happens after the divorce?" Julian's expression darkened with amusement. "Opal gets her settlement. The house situation gets finalized. Then everyone moves on." "You make it sound easy." "It is easy. Easy. 15 years. Easy." Opal remembered sitting beside hospital beds with Julian after his father died, holding him through panic attacks before investor meetings, selling her grandmother's jewelry to help fund his first expansion, skipping fertility treatments because Julian said the company needed him more right now. Easy. The waitress passed near Opal's table. "Would you like another drink?" Opal realized her cheeks were wet. She hadn't even noticed herself crying. "No," she whispered. At Julian's table, Sabrina laughed softly at something he said. Then Julian leaned forward and kissed her. Not aggressively, not recklessly, tenderly. Like a man kissing someone he cherished. And that finally shattered something inside Opal completely. Because Julian had not kissed her like that in years. The pain was almost physical. Sharp enough to steal oxygen. For one dangerous second, Opal considered walking over there, throwing the champagne in Sabrina's face, demanding answers, demanding dignity, demanding humanity. But another voice inside her whispered something colder. If a man can betray you this calmly, he already stopped fearing your pain a long time ago. So instead, Opal stayed silent. She watched. She listened. And in that terrible silence, clarity finally arrived. Not dramatic, not explosive, just devastatingly clear. Her marriage was over. Not because Julian slept with another woman, but because somewhere along the way he stopped seeing Opal as human. Julian checked his watch. "We should head upstairs." Sabrina smiled knowingly. Before standing, she glanced casually across the room, and for one horrifying moment, her eyes locked directly onto Opal. A flicker of recognition crossed Sabrina's face. Then something worse. Not guilt, not panic, pity. Sabrina leaned toward Julian and murmured something quietly. Julian frowned slightly and turned halfway, but Opal stood immediately and walked away before he could fully see her. Her heartbeat thundered violently as she crossed the lobby. The elevator doors opened behind her. She heard Sabrina's heels clicking softly against marble, but no one followed. Outside, rain soaked Opal within seconds. The cold hit hard enough to finally force air back into her lungs. She reached the curb, blindly shaking so badly she could barely unlock her phone. Then she froze. Because Julian's voice drifted faintly from the hotel entrance behind her. Careless, amused, deadly. After the divorce, he said casually, "Opal won't keep anything important anyway." Opal closed her eyes, and for the first time since falling in love with Julian Mercer, something inside her stopped breaking and started hardening. The Mercer family home looked less like a residence and more like a private museum designed by people who believed warmth was a weakness. Everything gleamed. Polished black marble floors, massive oil paintings in gold frames, crystal chandeliers hanging over rooms so large they echoed when people laughed. And tonight, every light in the estate burned bright for the Mercer family dinner. Opal Black stood in front of the bathroom mirror upstairs, adjusting the sleeve of her dark emerald dress while trying to steady her breathing. She looked beautiful. Not because of the dress, because something inside her had changed after the Crescent Hotel. The grief was still there, the humiliation too. But beneath both, something colder had started growing. Awareness. Julian walked into the dressing room, fastening his watch. "You ready?" he asked casually, as if he hadn't kissed another woman 3 nights ago. As if he hadn't destroyed 15 years of marriage while drinking champagne in Manhattan. Opal studied him carefully. How terrifying she thought that people could become strangers while still sharing a bed with you. "You okay?" Julian asked. She almost laughed. Not because the question was caring, because it was performative. The kind husbands asked when they needed plausible deniability later. "I'm fine," Opal answered softly. Julian nodded once. "Good. My mother invited a few people from the company tonight, so please don't start anything." The sentence hit like a slap. "Please don't embarrass me." That was what he really meant. Opal stared at him. "You think I'm the one who should be careful tonight?" Julian's jaw tightened immediately. "There's that tone again." "What tone?" "The victim tone." Opal looked away before he could see the hatred flicker briefly across her face. Hatred scared her, not because it existed, because she understood now how long it had been building quietly beneath years of silence. The drive to the Mercer estate passed mostly in silence. Julian answered emails in the back seat, while Opal stared out the window, watching snow fall over Connecticut streets decorated with expensive winter lights. At one point, Julian glanced up from his phone. "You've been acting strange lately." Strange. Not heartbroken, not distant, not devastated. Just inconveniently different. Opal folded her hands together. "I'm tired." Julian barely looked at her. "You're always tired. No concern. No curiosity. Just irritation." And suddenly, Opal understood something horrifying. Julian had stopped viewing her emotions as real years ago. To him, her pain was background noise. The Mercer estate glowed like a palace against the dark winter sky when they arrived. Valets rushed forward. Inside, laughter and music floated through the massive house. Evelyn Mercer greeted guests near the grand staircase wearing diamonds large enough to feed families for months. The moment she saw Opal, Her smile changed subtly. Not openly cruel. Worse. Dismissive. "There you are," Evelyn said, kissing Julian first. "I was beginning to think you two weren't coming." Julian kissed his mother's cheek warmly. "Traffic." Evelyn finally looked at Opal. "You look tired, dear." Opal smiled politely. "So do you." A tiny pause. Julian shot Opal a warning glance instantly. Evelyn recovered with a soft laugh. "Well, aren't we sharp tonight?" The dining room slowly filled with executives, investors, family friends, and Mercer relatives. Conversations floated around stock acquisitions, Aspen vacations, and private schools. Wealthy people always sounded so relaxed discussing things ordinary people spent lifetimes trying to survive. Grant Mercer arrived late, loud as always. Julian's younger brother wore arrogance like cologne. "There's the king himself," Grant announced, clapping Julian's shoulder. "I heard the acquisition numbers." Jesus Christ. Julian smirked modestly. "Nothing final yet?" "Oh, please," Grant laughed. "You basically own half the damn industry already." Then his eyes slid toward Opal. "And Opal still puts up with you somehow. That deserves an award." The table laughed lightly. Opal smiled faintly. Years ago, comments like that used to hurt. Now they simply revealed things. Who people were, what they valued, who they thought mattered. Dinner began beneath low golden lighting and perfectly folded linen napkins. Opal barely touched her food. Across the table, Julian charmed investors effortlessly, while Evelyn watched him with the pride of a woman convinced she created greatness personally. At some point, one of the guests smiled toward Opal. "So, Opal, are you still working in tech?" Before she could answer, Evelyn sighed dramatically. "Oh!" Opal stopped working years ago. Julian's success made that unnecessary. Unnecessary. As if Opal had retired from a hobby instead of sacrificing an entire career. "I used to build systems architecture," Opal answered calmly. Grant smirked while cutting his steak. "And now she survives family dinners. Honestly, harder job." More laughter. Julian said nothing. Not one word. Not even basic respect. And that silence hurt more than insults ever could. The conversation shifted toward Mercer Analytics. Investors praised Julian repeatedly, a visionary. Brilliant strategist. One of the smartest founders in New England. Every compliment landed like another stone against Opal's ribs. Because she remembered sleepless nights writing early infrastructure models while Julian panicked about funding. She remembered debugging systems while recovering from migraines. She remembered sacrificing motherhood because Julian insisted timing mattered more. And now history belonged entirely to him. A servant refilled wine glasses. Then Evelyn smiled suddenly. "Oh, good. She made it." Opal looked up and froze. Sabrina Vale walked into the dining room wearing a sleek, cream-colored dress that made her look like she belonged on magazine covers. Confident, elegant, composed. Julian didn't look surprised to see her. Of course he didn't. Because this was planned? Sabrina smiled warmly toward the table. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic from the city was awful." Evelyn stood immediately. "Sabrina, sweetheart, come sit near Julian." "Sweetheart." Opal felt something inside her stomach turn slowly. Sabrina approached gracefully, and when her eyes met Opal's, there it was again. That same pity from the hotel, as if Opal were already a ghost haunting her own marriage. "You must be exhausted," Sabrina said softly while taking her seat beside Julian. "Julian told me you haven't been feeling like yourself lately." The manipulation was so smooth, it almost sounded caring. Opal smiled. "Did he?" Julian took a drink without looking at either of them. Grant leaned back in his chair, grinning. Sabrina basically saved the Denver negotiations single-handedly. "Julian says She's irreplaceable. Something sharp flickered briefly in Sabrina's eyes. Pleasure. Julian finally looked toward Opal. You could learn a lot from Sabrina, honestly. The room went quiet for half a second. Not because the comment was loud, because it was humiliating. Publicly. Deliberately. Opal stared at her husband, at the man she once loved enough to build a future around. And for the first time, she saw him clearly, not stressed, not misunderstood, not emotionally damaged, cruel. Simple as that. Evelyn broke the silence lightly. Well, ambition matters. Some women evolve with successful men, others get too comfortable. Sabrina lowered her eyes modestly. Grant snorted into his whiskey. Julian said nothing. Again. Because he agreed. The realization settled over Opal with terrifying calm. They had all been waiting for this. Waiting for Julian to finally replace her with someone they considered more suitable for his success. Someone younger, sharper, more useful socially. And suddenly, Opal understood why Sabrina had looked at her with pity. Because everyone at this table already knew the marriage was ending. Everyone except her. Julian stood slowly lifting his wine glass. I actually wanted everyone here tonight because... He paused. There's something important I need to announce. The room quieted instantly. Opal already knew. She could feel it. Julian glanced briefly towards Sabrina before speaking. Opal and I have decided to move forward with a divorce. Silence. Then Evelyn exhaled softly, like someone relieved after holding her breath too long. Grant muttered about time. Someone else whispered awkward condolences. Sabrina remained carefully expressionless. Opal sat completely still, while the world narrowed into muffled noise around her. Not because she was shocked, because of the humiliation. The calculated public humiliation. Julian had not chosen privacy. He had chosen an audience. Then he finally looked directly at her, expecting tears, begging, collapse. Instead, Opal lifted her wine glass calmly and said one quiet word. Okay. The entire table froze. Because for the first time in 15 years, Opal Black did not ask Julian Mercer to love her. The divorce attorney's office overlooked Central Park from 40 floors above Manhattan. Everything inside the room was designed to intimidate quietly. Dark walnut walls, muted lighting, shelves lined with leather-bound legal volumes nobody probably read anymore. Power lived in rooms like this. Not loud power, precise power. And Julian Mercer sat comfortably in the center of it, like a man certain the outcome had already been decided. Opal Black arrived alone. No dramatic entrance, no emotional breakdown. Just a long black coat, tied back hair, and exhaustion sitting behind her eyes like something ancient. Naomi Bennett stood immediately when Opal entered. Tall, elegant, controlled. The kind of attorney who billed by the minute and destroyed people professionally for sport. Mrs. Black. Naomi greeted smoothly. Please sit. Opal took her seat across from Julian without looking directly at him. Still, she could feel his attention on her, studying her, waiting for weakness. Julian had always mistaken silence for weakness. That was going to become a very expensive mistake. Naomi folded her hands neatly atop the conference table. As we discussed previously, she began Mr. Mercer's wishes for this process to remain respectful and efficient. Opal almost smiled. Respectful. The man, publicly announcing divorce beside his mistress at a family dinner, wanted respect now. Interesting. Naomi slid a thick stack of papers toward her. The proposed settlement includes the Connecticut estate, the Manhattan penthouse, $3 million in liquid assets, and continued luxury support provisions. Julian leaned back slightly. Relaxed, generous, like a king distributing mercy. "You'll be comfortable," he said casually. "Comfortable." Opal remembered eating ramen noodles beside him on apartment floors while writing infrastructure systems that eventually made him millions. Now he spoke to her like a dependent receiving charity. Naomi continued. "In exchange, you waive future ownership claims connected to Mercer Analytics and agree to complete confidentiality." There it was. The real point of all this. Not the divorce. Protection. Julian was protecting the empire. Opal slowly flipped through the documents while the room remained silent. Page after page erased her existence with terrifying efficiency. Founder, Julian Mercer. Primary architect, Julian Mercer. Operational creator, Julian Mercer. Every line stripped her out of history like she had never been there at all. 15 years reduced to legal invisibility. Naomi spoke carefully. "This settlement is extremely favorable, Mrs. Black." Opal looked up finally. Is it Naomi's expression remained polite? "You will leave this marriage financially secure." Julian sighed softly, like he was exhausted already. "Opal, don't make this ugly." Ugly. The word nearly made her laugh. Because ugly had started years ago. Ugly was cheating on your wife while she still defended you publicly. Ugly was watching your family humiliate her and saying nothing. Ugly was letting another woman wear diamonds while your wife cried alone in a mansion you built together. But none of that counted to Julian. Only consequences counted. Opal closed the folder slowly. "What happens if I don't sign?" Naomi answered immediately. "Litigation, public exposure, delayed settlements, potential financial instability. Translation, fight back and we'll destroy you slowly." Julian leaned forward slightly. "You don't want a war, Opal?" No, she didn't. Because wars implied both sides still cared about what survived afterward. And Opal wasn't sure there was enough left inside her marriage worth saving anymore. Naomi slid another paper across the table. "We also included a timeline regarding relocation from the Connecticut property." Opal stared at the page. 30 days. 15 years of marriage reduced to 30 days to disappear. Julian checked his watch casually. He had another meeting afterward. Of course he did. Everything inside Opal suddenly became very still. Not peaceful, dangerous. She looked at Julian carefully. "You already moved her in emotionally before asking me to leave physically." Julian's jaw tightened instantly. Naomi interjected smoothly. "This meeting should remain productive." Opal ignored her. "How long?" she asked Julian quietly. Julian's expression hardened. "It doesn't matter." "That long?" He looked away first. "Answer enough." The room fell silent. Outside the windows, Manhattan moved normally beneath cold gray skies, while Opal's entire life quietly collapsed inside a luxury office. Then Naomi cleared her throat. "There is one more matter regarding archived company storage materials." Julian waved dismissively. "All junk." Opal's attention sharpened instantly. Naomi opened another file. Several legacy storage units contain outdated development records, early prototypes, notebooks, and operational backups from the company's initial stages. Julian smirked slightly. "You remember those boxes, God, we dragged them through 3 different offices?" Opal remembered. Every single box. Every sleepless night connected to them. Every idea scribbled at 3 in the morning while Julian dreamed out loud beside her. Naomi continued. "Mr. Mercer is prepared to retain ownership unless otherwise requested." Opal looked down slowly at the settlement papers, then at Julian, then back to Naomi. And in that moment something clicked together quietly inside her mind. Not revenge, recognition, a memory. One old document, One signature Julian had forgotten existed. Her pulse soared. For the first time since entering the office, Opal felt calm. "What if I don't want the house?" she asked softly. Julian frowned. Naomi blinked once. "I'm sorry. What if I don't want the penthouse either?" Julian laughed once under his breath. "Opal, what if I only want the storage archive transferred entirely into my name?" The room went silent. Naomi stared at her carefully now. Julian actually smiled. Not nervous, amused. "You're serious?" "Yes." Naomi adjusted slightly in her chair. "Mrs. Black, those materials have no meaningful financial value." "I know." Julian leaned back, laughing softly now. Jesus Christ. Opal remained perfectly calm. "I'll sign the ownership waivers," she said quietly. "I'll take no company shares, no future claims, no property disputes." Naomi narrowed her eyes slightly. But Opal folded her hands together. "I want every archived development file, storage unit, physical notebook, and legacy drive transferred solely to me." Julian exchanged a quick look with Naomi. He genuinely thought this was pathetic. That hurt more than if he had questioned her, because after 15 years together, he still underestimated her mind. "You're throwing away millions for sentimental garbage?" Julian asked. Opal met his gaze evenly. "Yes." Julian shook his head in disbelief. "You always get emotional around old memories. Not memories. Evidence." But he was too arrogant to see the difference. Naomi studied Opal carefully now. Something intelligent flickered behind the attorney's eyes. Suspicion. "Mrs. Black," Naomi said slowly, "can I ask why these materials matter so much to you?" Opal smiled faintly. "They're the only part of my marriage I built myself." That answer changed the room slightly. Even Julian noticed. But then he relaxed again, because narcissistic people rarely fear what they don't value personally. And Julian Mercer had spent years convincing himself Opal existed only in the background of his greatness. Naomi leaned toward Julian quietly. "We should review the archive transfer more carefully." Julian dismissed it immediately. "For what? There's nothing in those boxes except outdated systems." Opal lowered her eyes to hide the tiny flicker of emotion crossing her face, because that was the moment she knew. He truly had no idea. Julian picked up the pen and slid it toward her. "Take the deal, Opal. Not please. Not kindness. A command." Opal stared at the pen for several seconds, then signed. One signature after another. 15 years. Gone in ink. Julian signed immediately afterward without hesitation, like he couldn't wait to erase her officially. When everything was finalized, Naomi began organizing paperwork. Julian stood first. "I have another meeting downtown." Of course he did. He paused near the door. "You'll be okay," he said casually. Opal looked up slowly, and suddenly realized something extraordinary. He actually believed he was the generous one here. The realization nearly broke her heart all over again. Not because she loved him anymore, because she finally understood how little he had ever truly seen her. Julian left without another word. The office door closed behind him. Naomi gathered documents silently before speaking carefully. "You seem calmer than most people going through this process." Opal looked toward the massive city skyline outside the windows. "No," she said softly. "I'm just finally awake." That evening, while Julian celebrated his divorce victory at an exclusive rooftop bar with Sabrina Vale, Opal sat alone in her car outside a forgotten storage facility on the edge of Boston. Snow drifted slowly beneath flickering streetlights. In her lap sat a small silver key. And for the first time in years, Julian Mercer no longer frightened her. The storage facility sat at the edge of South Boston, beside an abandoned shipping yard nobody used anymore. Rust stained the metal fencing. Snow collected along cracked pavement. One flickering security light buzzed weakly above the office entrance, like it was struggling to stay alive. Opal Black sat motionless inside her car for nearly 3 minutes before finally stepping out. The cold hit immediately, sharp enough to sting her lungs. For a strange moment she thought about the Connecticut mansion Julian would return to later that night. Warm marble floors, fireplace glowing, expensive whiskey. Sabrina probably curled beside him already laughing at private jokes Opal would never hear. That thought should have broken her. Instead, it made her feel detached, like grief had exhausted itself and left only clarity behind. The old facility manager recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Mercer?" he asked, surprised. Opal forced a small smile. "Just Opal now." The man looked uncomfortable instantly. "Oh, right. Sorry. It's okay." He glanced toward the long hallway of storage units. "Your husband stopped paying for these years ago. I thought most of this stuff was abandoned." Her husband. The phrase sounded foreign now. "He transferred ownership this morning." The manager handed her a clipboard, Unit C-14. Opal nodded quietly and walked into the freezing corridor alone. Each step echoed softly. Metal doors lined both sides like forgotten graves. And in a way, this place was one. Buried dreams, buried versions of herself, buried proof of who she used to be before becoming Julian Mercer's invisible wife. When she reached Unit C-14, she stopped breathing for half a second. The old silver lock was still there, the same one she and Julian bought together 12 years ago at a hardware store after their second office flooded during winter. Back then, they had laughed while carrying boxes through snow together. You realize Julian had joked breathless, "If we become billionaires one day, this story gets really inspirational." Opal remembered laughing. "You're assuming we survive long enough to become billionaires." Julian kissed her forehead back then. "We survive everything." The memory hurt differently now. Not because she missed him, because she missed who she used to be when she believed him. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key. The lock clicked open. The metal door groaned upward slowly. Dust filled the cold air immediately. Rows of boxes stacked floor to ceiling appeared beneath dim overhead lighting. Old monitors, hard drives, prototype equipment, whiteboards covered in faded equations. And suddenly, Opal was 28 again, exhausted, brilliant, in love. The emotional force of it nearly knocked the air from her chest. She stepped inside carefully. Everything smelled like paper metal and forgotten years. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, staring. Because these boxes contained more truth about Mercer Analytics than Julian ever realized. And more truth about Opal herself than she had allowed herself to remember. She knelt beside the nearest box, slowly. Operational framework, initial build. Her handwriting, not Julian's. Opal opened it carefully. Inside were old notebooks filled with system architecture sketches, workflow models, scalability structures, coding maps. Page after page, all hers. She touched the paper gently, like it might disappear. For years, Julian had slowly rewritten history until even Opal herself started believing she had merely helped. But she hadn't helped. She built it with him. Maybe more than him. A sharp ache rose in her throat suddenly. Not because of the company, because she remembered how proud she used to feel creating these systems. Before marriage turned her brilliance into background decoration. Before she learned to shrink herself to protect Julian's ego. She opened another box. Investor prep folders, early financial models, operational logistics plans. Everywhere she looked, her fingerprints were all over the company's foundation. Not metaphorically, literally. Her notes, her signatures, her diagrams. And Julian had erased her anyway. The cruelty of that settled heavily into her chest. Not accidental erasure, intentional, systematic. A decision repeated over years until Opal herself disappeared from the narrative. Tears blurred her vision briefly. She wiped them away angrily. No, not anymore. Then she found the blue notebook, the one she remembered immediately. Leather cover worn at the edges, coffee stain near the spine. Inside were the original infrastructure concepts that eventually became Mercer Analytics' core operating system. Opal flipped through pages rapidly. Optimization structures, distribution flow logic, integrated predictive scaling. The same systems currently generating hundreds of millions annually. Her breathing slowed, because suddenly she remembered something else too. Something important. Julian never fully understood the architecture. Not originally. She taught him enough to explain it publicly. Enough to sell it. Enough to sound like the visionary founder investors wanted. But the deeper infrastructure, that was hers. Entirely hers. A strange feeling spread through her chest then. Not revenge. Recognition. The terrifying realization that she had spent years believing she needed Julian to survive. While standing on foundations she created herself. A sound interrupted her thoughts. Her phone vibrating. Harper's phone. Opal answered quietly. Hey. Harper immediately sighed. You disappeared for 6 hours. I was about to call the police. Opal almost smiled. I'm fine. You don't sound fine. No, Opal admitted softly. I sound awake. Silence. Then Harper asked carefully, Where are you? Opal looked around the storage unit. At the beginning. Harper frowned audibly through the phone. What does that mean? Opal picked up one of the notebooks slowly. It means Julian lied about more than the affair. Another long silence. Then Harper's voice softened. Opal? What did you find? Opal looked at her own handwriting covering page after page. Proof. Truth. Identity. Myself, she whispered. After hanging up, Opal continued sorting through boxes for hours. Some discoveries hurt. Old anniversary photos, tucked between documents. Tiny handwritten notes from Julian during their early years. Couldn't have done this without you. We're building this together. One day, everyone will know your genius too. Opal stared at one note for almost a full minute before setting it aside carefully. The saddest lies are the ones people probably meant when they first said them. Near midnight, she opened a small gray archive container shoved behind old servers. Inside sat several backup drives and one mini recorder. Opal frowned. She pressed play. Static crackled briefly. Then Julian's younger voice filled the storage unit. Excited, exhausted, alive. If this company succeeds, it's because of Opal. She built the entire operational backbone while I was freaking out about investors. Opal froze completely. The recording continued. Honestly, without her, Mercer Analytics doesn't exist. Her eyes closed slowly. Because hearing the truth in Julian's own voice hurt almost worse than the betrayal itself. He had known. All along. He knew exactly what she contributed, and still erased her publicly once success arrived. Opal sat down hard on the concrete floor. The pain finally came then. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep enough to hollow out entire parts of her chest. She cried silently inside the freezing storage unit while surrounded by evidence of the life she sacrificed for a man who eventually treated her like disposable furniture. Time blurred afterward. At some point, after 1 in the morning, Opal opened the final archive box near the back wall. Mostly legal paperwork, early licensing drafts, partnership discussions, insurance files. Then suddenly, she stopped moving. Her pulse slammed hard once against her ribs. She slowly pulled out a thick document folder labeled Foundational Intellectual Property Agreement. Opal's hands shook violently now. She opened it carefully. Her eyes scanned line after line, then widened. No, no way. She turned pages faster. Signature sections, transfer agreements, ownership terms, and then nothing. The final transfer authorization page was incomplete, unsigned. Julian's signature was there. Hers wasn't. Meaning the original intellectual property transfer had never been finalized legally. The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter, dangerous. Opal reread the pages twice to make sure she understood correctly. If these documents were valid, then substantial portions of Mercer Analytics' core infrastructure might still legally belong to her. Not emotionally, legally. Her breathing became shallow. The billion-dollar acquisition, the company expansion, the investors. Everything depended on clean ownership rights. And Julian had built his empire assuming she would never look back. A small sound escaped her throat, somewhere between disbelief and horror. Then Opal noticed something else clipped behind the agreement. One additional page, signed fully, by Julian Mercer himself, acknowledging her as co-creator. Forgotten, buried, fatal. Opal stared at the signature while snow fell quietly outside the storage facility. And for the first time, since her marriage began collapsing, Julian Mercer became vulnerable in her mind. Not powerful, not untouchable, vulnerable. Camille Brooks' office did not look like the office of someone powerful. That was Opal's first thought when she stepped inside. No marble lobby, no intimidating skyline views, no polished assistants whispering into headsets. Instead, the office sat inside a renovated brownstone in Boston with warm lighting overflowing bookshelves and framed newspaper articles covering civil litigation victories. The place felt lived in, sharp, human, which somehow made it more intimidating than Julian's corporate attorneys. Camille Brooks herself looked nothing like Naomi Bennett either. No designer softness, no carefully rehearsed charm. She wore dark slacks, no jewelry except a watch, and the kind of expression people developed after spending years watching wealthy men lie professionally. Camille studied Opal quietly across the desk. "You signed the divorce settlement already?" "Yes." "And waived future ownership claims?" "Yes." Camille leaned back slowly. "Then why exactly are you here?" Opal placed the old document folder onto the desk carefully. "Because I think my ex-husband built a billion-dollar company using intellectual property that legally still belongs to me." Silence. Camille did not react immediately, which somehow made her more terrifying. Most people would have laughed, or shown surprise. Camille simply opened the folder and started reading. For the first 10 minutes, the only sounds inside the office were paper turning and distant traffic outside. Opal sat motionless, trying to keep her breathing steady. She hadn't slept properly in days. Not because of Julian anymore, because suddenly her entire past looked different. Every sacrifice, every minimized achievement, every moment she allowed herself to become smaller so Julian could feel larger. Camille finally looked up. Who drafted these original agreements? Early corporate counsel during the startup years. And this transfer was never completed, no. Camille narrowed her eyes. "You're certain?" I checked 4 times. Camille opened another folder. The signed acknowledgement page. Julian's signature. Recognition of Opal as co-creator of the operational framework. Camille stared at it longer this time. Then she sat back slowly. "Well," she said quietly, "that's a problem." For the first time in days, Opal almost smiled. Not because she wanted revenge, because someone finally saw what Julian spent years erasing. Camille stood and walked toward the window thoughtfully. When was the acquisition announcement made public? 3 months ago. Estimated valuation, just over 800 million. Camille gave a low whistle. And none of their legal teams caught this. Opal shook her head. "I don't think Julian even remembered these existed." "No." Camille corrected calmly. "Men like Julian remember. They just convince themselves nobody else matters enough to challenge them." That sentence landed deeply. Because it was true. Julian had not forgotten Opal's contributions. He simply believed she would stay loyal forever. Even after betrayal. Even after humiliation. Even after being discarded. Camille turned back toward her. "Tell me something honestly, Opal." "Okay. Why didn't you fight for recognition years ago?" The question hurt because Opal already knew the answer. "I loved him." Camille's expression softened slightly. "No," she said gently. "You disappeared inside him." The room went silent. Opal looked down at her hands, and suddenly memories flooded back all at once, canceling job opportunities because Julian needed support during expansion phases, allowing investors to assume Julian created systems she designed, laughing off sexist comments at corporate events because causing tension might hurt Julian's image, even giving up fertility treatments after Julian said, "This isn't the right time for distractions." Distractions. That was what motherhood became inside Julian's ambition. Camille returned to her desk. "Do you still love him?" Opal thought carefully before answering. "No." Then after a pause, "I think I loved who he used to pretend to be." Camille nodded once, like she understood completely. "Good. That makes this easier." She opened a legal pad and started writing rapidly. "Here's the situation. If your documentation holds under forensic review, the Mercer Analytics potentially misrepresented foundational ownership during acquisition negotiations." Opal swallowed hard. That serious Camille looked up directly. "Opal, if this is valid, the entire acquisition could freeze instantly." A strange feeling spread through Opal's chest. Not triumph, fear. Because suddenly, this was no longer emotional, this was nuclear. Camille continued. "The acquiring company will panic over intellectual property exposure. Investors panic when ownership becomes uncertain." Opal looked toward the rain outside the office windows. "I never wanted to destroy him." Camille's voice became sharper. "Women like you always say that." Opal blinked slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means men destroy women emotionally for years, and somehow women still worry about protecting them afterward." The truth of it stung. Because even now, after everything Julian had done, part of Opal still instinctively wanted to soften consequences for him. That realization disgusted her. Camille leaned forward. "Let me ask you another question." Opal nodded slowly. "If Julian had discovered you built your success on his work, erased his contributions publicly, cheated on him, then tried forcing him out quietly with money." Camille paused. "Do you think he would hesitate to destroy you?" Opal already knew the answer. No. Julian would burn everything to survive. Camille saw recognition flicker across her face. Exactly. The office door opened briefly, and Camille's assistant stepped inside. "You have a call from Danielle Reed's office." Camille raised an eyebrow. That was fast. After the assistant left, Camille explained calmly. "Danielle Reed is overseeing the acquisition personally.
which means his team probably heard rumors already. Opal frowned. Rumors. Camille held up the signed co-creator acknowledgement. This kind of thing spreads quietly among executives before exploding publicly. A wave of anxiety hit Opal suddenly. This could become massive. It already is. Camille picked up another document.
Especially because your ex-husband appears to have intentionally excluded you from ownership narratives, despite written acknowledgement. The word intentionally echoed heavily, because that was the wound underneath everything. Julian did not accidentally erase her. He chose to, repeatedly, carefully, over years. A knock interrupted them again. This time, Camille's assistant looked uncertain. "There's someone here asking about Mrs. Black." Opal stiffened immediately. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Miles Bennett." Opal blinked in surprise. Miles Bennett was one of Mercer Analytics' senior executives. Quiet, respected. One of the few people at the company who had known Opal during the early startup years. Camille glanced toward Opal. "Do you want me to send him away?" Opal hesitated. Then slowly, "No." "Let him in." Miles entered looking visibly uncomfortable. Mid-50s, exhausted eyes, expensive suit loosened at the collar. The expression on his face told Opal everything before he even spoke. He knew. "I'm sorry for showing up unannounced," Miles said carefully. Camille gestured toward the chair, but remained silent. Miles looked directly at Opal. "I heard there may be legal concerns involving the acquisition." Opal crossed her arms slightly, and Miles exhaled slowly. "I always wondered how Julian understood the infrastructure so quickly during the early years." The room quieted instantly. Miles looked genuinely ashamed now. "You were the technical mind behind the company, weren't you? Not helping, not assisting. Behind it." Recognition hit Opal so hard she almost couldn't speak, because no one had ever said it out loud before. Not publicly, not clearly. Miles rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I should have said something years ago." "Why didn't you?" Opal asked softly. He looked embarrassed. "Because Julian controlled everything by then. And because—" He paused painfully. "You stopped correcting people." That one hurt. Because it was true. At some point, Opal had started participating in her own erasure. Not intentionally. But survival inside toxic love often required silence. Miles reached into his briefcase slowly. "I made copies of old meeting transcripts years ago, just in case." Camille's attention sharpened immediately. Why? Miles gave a humorless laugh. "Because brilliant men who rewrite history usually keep doing it." He handed over the documents. Camille flipped through them rapidly, then looked up sharply. "These directly reference Opal's system architecture contributions." Miles nodded. "And there are witnesses." The room suddenly felt charged, dangerous, real. Opal stared at the papers while her pulse thundered softly in her ears. For years she had felt invisible. Now suddenly the truth was surfacing from everywhere. Camille closed the folder carefully, then looked directly at Opal. "This stopped being a divorce the moment Julian Mercer underestimated you. And for the first time since her marriage collapsed." Opal believed it. The rooftop of the Halcyon Tower looked like the kind of place where powerful men celebrated themselves before the world had time to question them. Glass walls reflected Manhattan's midnight skyline in fractured gold. A live jazz trio played near the infinity pool. Champagne flowed endlessly beneath hanging crystal lights, while executives in tailored suits congratulated Julian Mercer for becoming one of the youngest tech founders in New England history to secure an acquisition near $1 billion. Everything about the night screamed victory, and Julian wore it beautifully. Opal stood across the street beneath cold February wind, watching the building from inside a black car.
Her pulse was steady, which frightened her, because a month ago she would have been shaking, crying, begging herself not to look. Now she simply observed, like someone finally waking up from anesthesia. Camille sat beside her, reviewing documents one final time. "Once we walk in," she said calmly, "everything changes." Opal stared at the glowing rooftop windows above them. It already changed. Camille studied her carefully. "You can still stop this." Opal looked down at the thick folder resting in her lap. Inside sat 15 years of buried truth. Proof. Recognition. Ownership. Julian's own signature waiting like a loaded weapon. "I'm not doing this to ruin him," Opal whispered. Camille gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "That's what makes you dangerous." Upstairs, Julian Mercer raised a champagne glass while applause erupted around him. Sabrina Vale stood beside him, wearing silver silk and diamonds bright enough to blind cameras. She looked perfect beside him, polished, controlled, chosen. And strangely, Opal no longer envied her, because women like Sabrina often won men who eventually betrayed them too. Just later, Julian smiled confidently toward the crowd. "This acquisition represents the beginning of an entirely new chapter," he announced smoothly. More applause. Daniel Reed stood nearby listening carefully. Tall, sharp-eyed, one of the most respected acquisition executives in corporate America. The kind of man who could make billion-dollar decisions during lunch. Julian continued speaking. "When I started Mercer Analytics from a tiny apartment with nothing but ambition," Opal almost laughed softly inside the elevator. Nothing but ambition, not true. He started with her. The elevator doors opened onto the rooftop. Conversations continued. Music floated softly. Then slowly people began noticing her. Recognition spread across the room in quiet waves. Whispers, turning heads, sudden silence. Opal stepped onto the rooftop, wearing a fitted white coat over a black dress, so elegant it made several women glance downward instinctively. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, because for the first time in years, she dressed like someone visible. Julian saw her almost immediately. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation, to amusement. Like he thought she had arrived emotionally desperate. Sabrina stiffened beside him instantly. Daniel Reed followed Julian's gaze. "Who's that?" Julian forced a relaxed smile. "My ex-wife. Ex-wife." The word hit differently now. Not painful. Liberating. Julian crossed the rooftop toward her with practiced calm. "Opal," he said quietly. "This is unexpected. You always hated surprises." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You shouldn't be here." "Interesting." "Not, are you okay? Not what do you need? Only concern about optics." Camille stepped beside Opal. Julian noticed her immediately. The amusement disappeared from his face. "And you are Camille Brooks." Recognition flashed across Julian's eyes. Corporate litigation. Danger. His posture changed subtly. "Why is a litigation attorney at my acquisition party?" Camille smiled politely. "That depends how honest you've been with your investors." The air between them shifted instantly. Julian looked toward Opal carefully now. Not dismissively anymore, cautiously. "What is this?" Opal met his gaze evenly. "The truth." Sabrina approached slowly behind Julian. Elegant smile perfectly in place. Opal she greeted softly. "You look well." The manipulation in her voice was almost artistic. Opal looked directly at the bracelet still wrapped around Sabrina's wrist. The same bracelet from the Crescent Hotel. Sabrina noticed. And for the first time, looked uncomfortable. Julian lowered his voice sharply.
This is not the place.
No, Opal agreed quietly. You should have thought about that before building a public life on private lies. Julian's jaw tightened. Around them, conversations had nearly stopped completely now. Powerful people sensed disaster the way animals sensed storms. Daniel Reed approached calmly holding a champagne glass. Julian, he said evenly. Is there a problem? Julian answered too quickly. No. Camille handed Daniel a business card. I'm afraid there may be significant legal concerns regarding intellectual property ownership connected to Mercer Analytics. Silence. Complete. Dead silence. Daniel looked at the card, then at Opal, then back at Julian. Nobody moved. Julian forced a short laugh. This is absurd. Is it? Camille asked. Sabrina's composure began slipping slightly now. Julian, she whispered carefully. He ignored her. Daniel Reed became very still in the way dangerous executives often did before making brutal decisions. What exactly are you implying? He asked. Camille opened the folder calmly. We believe substantial portion of Mercer Analytics' foundational operational infrastructure may legally belong to Mrs. Black. The rooftop atmosphere changed instantly. Executives nearby pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Julian's face darkened. You've lost your mind.
No, Opal said quietly. You just spent years convincing yourself I had no value. That landed. Hard. Because deep down, Julian knew exactly what she meant. Daniel held out his hand slowly. May I? Camille handed him several copies. Julian stepped forward immediately. This is a misunderstanding. No, Camille corrected. This is documentation. Daniel scanned the pages rapidly. The signed co-creator acknowledgement. The incomplete intellectual property transfer. Original infrastructure records. Julian's own signature. Opal watched the exact moment Daniel realized the danger. His entire expression changed. Not emotional. Financial. Which somehow frightened Julian more. You told us ownership rights were fully consolidated, Daniel said coldly. They are. Camille spoke calmly. Apparently not. Julian turned toward Opal sharply. You're seriously doing this here? Opal stared at him. You announced our divorce at a family dinner beside your mistress. His face hardened instantly. This has nothing to do with our marriage. Opal almost smiled. That's the first honest thing you've said in years. Daniel closed the folder slowly. We need a private conference room. Immediately. The jazz music continued awkwardly in the background while executives exchanged nervous looks across the rooftop. Sabrina stepped toward Julian quietly. You said she signed everything. She did. Then how is this happening? Julian looked genuinely shaken now. Because for the first time since their marriage began collapsing, he no longer controlled the narrative. And Julian Mercer depended on control the way some people depended on oxygen. Danielle motioned toward security discreetly. Pause media access to the rooftop. That one sentence changed everything, because now it was real. Investors noticed. Executives noticed. Panic began moving quietly through the party like invisible smoke. Julian turned toward Opal again, lowering his voice dangerously. What do you want? The old Opal would have answered differently. The old Opal would have softened, explained herself, protected him emotionally. But that woman had died slowly over 15 years. So Opal simply looked him directly in the eyes and said, I want you to finally understand what happens when you erase the wrong woman. For the first time since she met him, Julian Mercer looked afraid of her. And upstairs above Manhattan's glittering skyline, surrounded by billionaires and cameras and collapsing illusions, Opal Black realized something extraordinary. She was no longer fighting to be loved, she was fighting to be acknowledged, and that battle she intended to win. The private conference room overlooking Manhattan had no music. No champagne, no glittering skyline magic anymore. Just silence heavy enough to suffocate people. Daniel Reed sat at the center of the long glass table, reading the documents again, while two corporate attorneys beside him exchanged increasingly alarmed looks. Across from them, Julian Mercer looked like a man trying desperately not to panic publicly. Sabrina Vale sat beside him, unnaturally still hands folded tightly in her lap. And Opal Black sat quietly beside Camille Brooks, watching the entire illusion begin to crack. Not explode, crack, which was somehow worse. Because collapse looked slower, up close. Danielle finally lowered the papers. "Tell me," he said calmly to Julian, "why your ex-wife possesses documentation identifying herself as co-creator of the company's operational architecture." Julian answered immediately. "Because she helped during early development." "Helped?" Opal almost smiled. Even now, he still minimized her instinctively. Camille slid another document across the table. According to this signed acknowledgement, Mrs. Black designed the foundational infrastructure framework independently before Mercer Analytics officially existed. Danielle's eyes sharpened. "Is that accurate?" Julian's jaw flexed. "It's being exaggerated." Camille opened one of the archived notebooks. "Then, perhaps you'd like to explain why the earliest system models are entirely in Opal's handwriting." Julian looked toward Opal finally. Not like a husband, not even like an enemy. Like someone trying to calculate damage. And somehow, that hurt more than the affair ever had. Because 15 years together had ended with him viewing her as a threat assessment. Daniel leaned back slowly. "Julian, did you knowingly omit intellectual property complications during acquisition negotiations?" "No." "Too fast." Danielle noticed, too. The room became even quieter. Opal watched Julian carefully. She knew him better than anyone. The tightening around his eyes, the subtle tapping against the table, the controlled breathing. Julian Mercer was terrified. But not because he hurt her, because he might lose. One of Daniel's attorneys spoke next. "If ownership transfer remained incomplete, then any commercialization of the platform potentially exposes Mercer Analytics to substantial legal vulnerability." Sabrina turned toward Julian sharply. "You told me everything was protected." There it was. Not concern for Opal, not morality, self-preservation. Julian snapped quietly. "Stop talking." The attorney continued flipping through documents. These meeting transcripts reference Opal Black repeatedly as lead systems architect. Miles Bennett's copies. Camille calmly added, "We also possess audio recordings from Mr. Mercer himself, acknowledging Mrs. Black as the primary architect behind the company's operational backbone." Julian's face drained slightly. Daniel looked at him carefully now. "Is that true?" Julian stayed silent, and silence answered louder than denial ever could. Opal sat perfectly still while the room shifted around her. It was surreal. For years nobody listened when she spoke. Now billion-dollar executives were hanging on to every word connected to her existence. Recognition felt strange after prolonged invisibility. Painful even. Daniel stood slowly and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. "When this acquisition began," he said quietly, "I was told Mercer Analytics was built by one visionary founder." He turned back toward Julian. "Now I'm discovering the foundation may belong to a woman you erased completely from the narrative." Julian's voice hardened. "This is personal revenge." Opal looked directly at him. "No, Julian. Revenge would have been exposing your affair publicly before the divorce." That landed hard. Sabrina visibly stiffened. Opal continued calmly. "This is accountability." Julian laughed once under his breath, cold, disbelieving. "You signed away your claims." Camille answered before Opal could. She signed away claims to assets disclosed honestly. Fraudulent omission changes legal exposure significantly. The word fraud changed the room instantly. Because now this wasn't emotional scandal anymore. It was corporate danger. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. How long have you known about this, Opal? She hesitated truthfully. Only recently. That's convenient, Julian muttered. Opal ignored him. I spent years believing my contributions didn't matter enough to fight for. Daniel studied her face carefully. And now Opal looked at Julian, then back at Daniel. Now I understand that being underestimated can become very expensive. One of the attorneys whispered something quietly to Daniel. Daniel nodded grimly, then looked directly at Julian. We're suspending acquisition proceedings, effective immediately. Silence. Absolute silence. Julian blinked once. You can't be serious. Daniel's expression remained cold. I'm extremely serious. You're going to freeze an $800 million acquisition over old paperwork. No, Daniel corrected. Over ownership uncertainty. Julian stood abruptly. This is insane. No, Daniel said again calmly. What's insane is apparently building a corporate empire while pretending the woman who designed your infrastructure never existed. The words hit the room like broken glass. Opal felt her heartbeat pound hard once, because someone powerful had finally said it aloud. Publicly. Without minimizing her, Julian turned sharply toward her. What exactly do you want? There it was again. The assumption that everything had a price, that she must be negotiating emotionally. Opal looked at him for a long moment, then quietly said, I wanted you to tell the truth years ago. Something flickered across Julian's face then, very briefly. Not remorse, recognition. Because deep down, he knew exactly when he started rewriting history. And he knew why. Opal's brilliance threatened his identity. So he slowly removed her from the story until even she stopped defending herself. Sabrina suddenly spoke. Julian said you stopped participating in the company voluntarily. Opal turned toward her calmly. I stopped because every room treated my intelligence like temporary support for his ambition. Sabrina opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. Because there was no defense against truth, spoken calmly. Daniel's assistant entered quickly. Sir, financial media is already reporting unusual delays surrounding the acquisition announcement. Of course they were. News traveled faster than loyalty in corporate America. Julian looked furious now. Who leaked this? Camille answered smoothly. Probably someone who realized hidden ownership disputes terrify shareholders. Daniel ignored the interruption. Will require immediate forensic review of all foundational intellectual property. Julian leaned over the table dangerously. You're destroying years of work over technicalities. Opal finally stood too, and for the first time in years, she no longer felt smaller than him. No, she said softly. You destroyed years of work the moment you convinced yourself I didn't deserve credit for it. Julian stared at her, and suddenly memories crashed visibly across his face. Late nights in Boston. Opal coding beside him. Opal fixing investor models. Opal teaching him systems he later claimed publicly as his own. For a terrifying second, he looked ashamed. Real shame. But it vanished almost instantly beneath anger. Because narcissistic people often preferred rage over guilt. Rage felt more powerful. Daniel gathered the documents carefully. Until ownership is verified, all acquisition activity pauses immediately. One sentence. One sentence erased nearly $1 billion from Julian's future overnight. Sabrina stood abruptly. I need some air. Nobody stopped her. The moment the door closed behind her, Julian turned toward Opal with a look she had never seen before. Hatred mixed with fear. You think this makes you powerful? Opal answered quietly. No. Then after a pause, I think the truth scares people who spent years hiding from it. Julian laughed bitterly. You'll regret this. Opal looked at him sadly. The strange thing was, she didn't hate him anymore. Not fully. Because hatred required emotional attachment. And somewhere between the hotel affair, the public humiliation, and the legal erasure, something inside her finally died. What remained now was clarity. You know what the saddest part is? She asked softly. Julian said nothing. You could have shared the credit. You could have respected me. You could have told the truth. Her eyes locked onto his, and I still would have loved you. For the first time all night. Julian looked away first. A phone vibrated loudly on the table. Then another. Then another. Executives, investors, board members. Panic spreading in real time. Daniel exhaled heavily. This is going public by morning. Julian closed his eyes briefly. And Opal realized something extraordinary as she watched the empire around him begin trembling. Julian Mercer never feared losing his wife. He feared losing the version of himself built on her silence. By morning, Julian Mercer's name was everywhere. Not on magazine covers, not in acquisition headlines celebrating visionary success, but in financial blogs, investor forums, legal speculation threads, and whispered conversations inside Manhattan boardrooms. Questions spread faster than facts. Hidden ownership dispute. Potential intellectual property conflict. Mercer Analytics acquisition delayed unexpectedly. Anonymous insiders claim founder misrepresented company origins. Corporate America loved success, but it loved scandal even more. Opal Black sat barefoot on the floor of her new apartment, watching snowfall drift past enormous windows, while CNBC quietly played in the background. The apartment was smaller than the Connecticut mansion, smaller than the Manhattan penthouse Julian offered her. But for the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful. No tension crawling beneath walls. No waiting for Julian's mood. No shrinking herself to keep a powerful man comfortable. Just stillness. Harper Sloan walked into the kitchen carrying coffee cups. You've officially broken Wall Street, she announced. Opal exhaled softly. I didn't want this. Harper handed her coffee. That may actually be the saddest thing about you. Opal frowned slightly. Harper sat beside her. You still think kindness means protecting people who hurt you? The words lingered heavily. Because Harper wasn't wrong. Even now, Opal still woke up with instinctive guilt twisting through her chest. Not guilt for exposing truth. Guilt for becoming difficult. Women like Opal were trained young to confuse silence with goodness. Meanwhile, Julian Mercer had spent 15 years weaponizing her silence for profit. The television shifted to another segment. Mercer Analytics, stock projections, unstable following acquisition uncertainty. Analysts expect aggressive internal review. Opal muted the screen immediately. She couldn't watch Julian collapse like entertainment. Not yet. Her phone buzzed against the table. Julian, again. 23 missed calls since midnight, 4 voicemails, 12 text messages. The latest read, we need to talk immediately. Interesting. For years, Opal begged for conversations Julian considered inconvenient. Now, suddenly, communication mattered. She locked the phone without responding. Harper noticed. You're really ignoring him? Yes. How does it feel? Opal thought carefully. Quiet. Not satisfying. Not triumphant. Just quiet. And after years of emotional chaos, quiet felt almost sacred across Manhattan. Julian Mercer was unraveling. Not publicly. Not yet.
Men like Julian learned early how to perform composure even while drowning. But privately, everything was collapsing. The board meeting started at 8 sharp. Every executive inside the conference room looked tense. Miles Bennett avoided eye contact completely. Sabrina Vale sat stiffly near the end of the table, staring at legal documents without blinking. Julian entered exactly on time. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect mask. But the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed him instantly. One board member spoke first. What exactly is happening? Julian remained standing. A personal dispute is being exaggerated into a legal concern. Miles finally looked up. With respect, Julian co-creator, documentation is not a personal dispute. The room shifted uncomfortably. Julian's eyes darkened. Careful, Miles. No, Miles answered quietly. Careful is what everyone's been for years. Silence. Julian realized too late that fear weakened once powerful men started bleeding publicly. Another executive slid a tablet across the table. Daniel Reed's team suspended all acquisition activity pending forensic review. Julian scanned the email quickly, jaw tightening. This is temporary. Nobody answered, because everyone knew temporary corporate panic often became permanent catastrophe. Sabrina finally spoke carefully. You told me the divorce settlement protected us. Us. That word hit Julian wrong. Because suddenly Sabrina sounded less like a lover and more like another investor demanding reassurance. Julian rubbed his forehead. I didn't know Opal had those files. Miles gave a short, humorless laugh. You forgot who built half this company, Julian snapped instantly. She did not build this company. But even he no longer sounded certain. Miles stared directly at him. She built enough of it that you spent 15 years making sure nobody noticed. That one landed hard. Because truth always sounded different when spoken publicly. Julian slammed his folder shut. Meeting adjourned. Nobody moved immediately. The authority in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Later that afternoon, Julian sat alone inside his office staring at old photographs spread across his desk. Young Julian and Opal standing inside their first tiny office. Opal asleep over a laptop at 3 a.m. Opal smiling beside whiteboards covered in system maps. For years, those photos looked sentimental. Now they looked dangerous. Because suddenly, every memory contained evidence. A knock interrupted him. Naomi Bennett entered briskly holding another folder. We have problems. Julian laughed bitterly. I noticed. Naomi remained standing. Daniel Reed's attorneys are requesting complete forensic review of all foundational intellectual property. Julian leaned back exhausted. Handle it. Naomi's expression hardened. You still don't understand the scale of this. That irritated him instantly. Then explain it. Naomi dropped the folder onto his desk. If Opal Black proves substantial authorship and intentional exclusion, this becomes exposure risk on multiple levels. Julian's patience snapped. She signed the settlement. Yes, Naomi replied coldly. Because you assumed she was emotionally attached to you, not legally dangerous. The words hit harder than he expected, because somewhere, deep beneath the anger, Julian realized Naomi was right. He underestimated Opal completely, not because she lacked intelligence, because she loved him. And Julian had confused love with weakness for so long that he no longer understood the difference. Naomi continued. You should have disclosed her involvement years ago. Julian looked away. She didn't want attention. That's not the point. No, it wasn't. The point was simpler. Julian enjoyed being the only genius in the story. Meanwhile, across the city, Opal walked slowly through a furniture store alone. Normal people surrounded her, couples arguing over couches, children running between displays. coffee machines humming softly. The ordinariness of it almost made her emotional, because for years her life revolved entirely around Julian's world. Corporate dinners, investor events, luxury performance, constant emotional management. Now suddenly she was choosing bookshelves for herself. A tiny thing, but it felt enormous. Her phone buzzed again. Julian. This time voicemail. Against her better judgment, Opal pressed play. His voice came through, strained and low. Opal, pick up the phone. Silence. Then you're making this worse than it needs to be. She almost laughed. Even now, he spoke like a man negotiating damage control. Not heartbreak, not accountability. Management. Then his voice shifted slightly softer. I know you're angry. Angry. Such a small word for what he did. Opal ended the message halfway through. A woman nearby smiled politely at her while testing lamps. The normalcy of that nearly broke Opal unexpectedly, because she realized something devastating. Most people would never understand what it felt like to disappear inside someone else's ambition for 15 years. That night, snow fell heavily across Manhattan. Opal sat alone, assembling a bookshelf herself, when someone knocked at her apartment door. Not aggressive, not loud. 3 careful knocks. Her body immediately tensed. She already knew. Harper peeked out from the kitchen. You expecting someone? No. But deep down, yes. Opal walked slowly toward the door, every step heavy. When she opened it, Julian Mercer stood in the hallway wearing a dark coat dusted with snow. And for the first time since she met him, he looked lost. Not powerful, not polished, just exhausted. His eyes moved across the apartment silently. Small space, half-unpacked boxes, simple furniture, a life beginning again without him. Julian looked back at her quietly. We need to talk. Opal stared at the man she once would have destroyed herself to keep, and realized something almost terrifying. She no longer feared losing him, because she already had, years ago. Snow clung to Julian Mercer's coat as he stood outside Opal's apartment door looking like a man who had finally discovered that power could not negotiate with consequences. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The hallway remained quiet, except for distant elevator sounds and the soft hum of city heat moving through vents overhead. Opal studied him carefully. He looked older, not physically, emotionally. Like the last 72 hours had stripped something from him he could never fully recover. Maybe certainty, maybe ego, maybe the illusion that he could destroy people without eventually standing inside the ruins too. Julian glanced past her shoulder into the apartment again. You moved fast. Opal crossed her arms lightly. You told me to leave the house in 30 days. His jaw tightened. That's not what I meant. Interesting, because it was exactly what he meant. He simply never expected her to survive it gracefully. Harper appeared briefly from the kitchen holding wine glasses. The moment she saw Julian, her expression turned cold instantly. I'll be in the other room, she said to Opal quietly. Julian waited until Harper disappeared before speaking again. You're really doing this? Opal almost laughed. Even now he framed himself as the victim of her actions instead of the architect of his own collapse. You cheated on me. Julian exhaled heavily. This isn't about Sabrina anymore. No, Opal agreed softly. It's about who you became. That landed harder than shouting would have. Julian stepped inside when she moved aside silently. The apartment was warm, simple. Books stacked near unfinished shelves. Soft lighting, half-open boxes near the walls. A real life, not a performance. Julian looked strangely uncomfortable inside it, as if authenticity itself unsettled him now. "You built all this already?" he asked. "I'm trying." He nodded once, then finally looked directly at her. Daniel Reed suspended everything. Opal stayed quiet. "The board is panicking. Investors are threatening withdrawal." His voice sharpened slightly. "Do you understand what this could cost me?" There it was. "Nod." "Do you understand what you meant to me?" "Nod." "I'm sorry." "Only lost calculation." Opal stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Do you understand what you cost me?" Silence. Julian looked away first, and suddenly, years of swallowed pain rose inside her chest all at once. Not dramatic pain, accumulated pain. The kind built quietly over thousands of moments. Ignored calls, dismissed feelings, lonely dinners, public humiliations, tiny emotional deaths repeated so often they became routine. "You erased me," Opal whispered. Julian rubbed his forehead tiredly. "That's not fair." She actually laughed then, a short, broken laugh, full of disbelief. "Not fair." Her eyes filled instantly now. "Julian, you introduced your mistress to your family before ending our marriage. It wasn't like that. You kissed her in public while I was still wearing my wedding ring." He looked stunned for half a second. "You followed me. I watched my husband laugh with another woman while talking about how little I mattered." The guilt finally appeared briefly across his face. Real guilt. But Opal no longer trusted guilt that arrived only after consequences. Julian stepped closer carefully. "I know I hurt you." "No." Her voice cracked softly. "You destroyed me slowly." That silenced him completely. Because it was true. The affair hurt, but the emotional erosion hurt worse. The years of becoming invisible beside a man who once adored her. Julian sat down heavily on the couch. For the first time in their marriage, he looked uncertain around her. "I never meant for things to get this bad." Opal stared at him in disbelief. He looked up. "How what? How do men destroy women they once loved and still say things like that?" Julian's eyes hardened defensively. "You think this is all on me?" There it was again. The refusal to stand fully inside accountability. Opal walked toward the window slowly. Snow covered Manhattan below, like silence, swallowing noise. "You know the worst part?" she asked quietly. Julian said nothing. "I spent years thinking, if I loved you better, supported you harder, stayed quieter." Her voice trembled slightly. "You would eventually love me the way you used to." Julian closed his eyes briefly. "Opal, but you didn't want love anymore." She turned toward him slowly. "You wanted worship." The truth hit visibly. Because Julian Mercer had spent years surrounding himself with admiration while starving the woman who built his life emotionally. He stood abruptly. "That's not true."
Really? Yes. Then why was I only valuable when I was useful? Silence again. Opal continued before he could escape it. "I gave up my career for you. I never asked you to." The sentence slipped out automatically, reflexively. And the moment it did, Julian realized too late what he'd done. Opal physically flinched, because that sentence had haunted her for years. The ultimate dismissal, as if sacrifice only mattered when formally requested. Julian ran a hand through his hair roughly. That came out wrong. No, Opal whispered. It came out honest. The room felt painfully small now. Julian looked around helplessly. "I was under pressure all the time. So was I." "You don't understand what it takes to build something at that level." Opal stared at him,
And suddenly, anger finally arrived fully. Sharp, clear, alive. I built it too. The words exploded out of her before she could stop them. Julian froze. Opal's chest rose shakily. You stood on stages taking credit for systems I designed, while I sat quietly in the audience smiling for cameras. Tears burned down her face now. Do you know what that does to someone? Julian looked genuinely shaken. Not by the legal exposure, by the emotional truth. Because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. Opal stepped closer. You know what's terrifying, she whispered. I loved you so much, I helped you erase me. Julian looked like he wanted to say something. Apologize maybe, explain, but there are some wounds language arrives too late to heal. Finally, he spoke quietly. I did love you. Opal's eyes closed briefly. Past tense. There it was. Clean and final. Did. Not do. Did. And strangely, hearing it out loud brought relief. Because for years, she blamed herself for failing to save a marriage already abandoned emotionally by the other person. You loved needing me, she said softly. Julian frowned. That's not fair. No, Opal whispered again. You loved being admired. You loved that I made life easier. You loved that I protected your ego. Her eyes met his directly. But you stopped loving me once I stopped making you feel powerful. Julian looked devastated now. Actually, devastated. And for one dangerous second, Opal almost softened. Because despite everything, this was still the man she once planned entire futures around. Then she remembered Sabrina's bracelet, the family dinner, the hotel, the years of loneliness, and the softness disappeared. Julian sat back down, slowly, voice quieter now. What do you want from me? Finally. Not a demand, a question. Opal thought carefully, then answered honestly. Nothing. That hurt him more than rage would have. She could see it instantly. Because men like Julian survived on emotional relevance. And Opal had finally removed him from the center of her emotional world. His eyes became glassy suddenly. Real emotion this time. Not performance. I'm losing everything. The words came out broken. Opal stared at him. And for the first time, she believed he understood even a fraction of what abandonment felt like. But only now that it touched him personally. That realization killed the last remaining piece of her love. Quietly, completely. A long silence passed between them. Then Julian whispered, I don't know how this happened. Opal looked at him sadly. Yes, you do. Her voice remained soft. That's why you spent years making sure nobody listened to me. Julian looked down at his hands. And in that moment, Opal realized something tragic. He truly had loved her once. Before ambition consumed him. Before ego became addiction. Before power taught him that admiration mattered more than intimacy. But love that arrives too late is just another form of grief. Julian finally stood slowly near the door. Before leaving, he turned back toward her. I never thought you'd do this to me. Opal looked at the man who spent years dismantling her identity piece by piece, then quietly answered, No. You just never thought I'd survive you. The first article appeared at 6:12 a.m. By noon, there were 17 more. By evening, Opal Black's face was everywhere. Not as a systems architect. Not as the woman who helped build Mercer Analytics. Not even as Julian Mercer's betrayed wife. But as something easier for the internet to consume, the bitter ex-wife trying to destroy her former husband. Opal stared numbly at her phone while headlines blurred together. Insiders claim divorce, revenge-motivated legal attack, former wife, targets, Mercer billions,
was Julian Mercer set up, and beneath every article, thousands of comments. Cruel strangers discussing her life like entertainment. She's obviously angry he moved on. Women always do this after divorce. If she really built the company, why wait until now? That's what bitter looks like. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was how familiar they felt. Women were always believable while sacrificing, never while demanding recognition. Harper snatched the phone gently from Opal's hand. You need to stop reading comments. Opal laughed weakly. I forgot how much people hate women who stop suffering quietly. Harper sat beside her on the couch. The apartment felt darker lately, despite sunlight pouring through the windows. Not because Opal regretted what she'd done, because public humiliation reopened wounds she thought she had already survived privately. You okay, Harper? Asked softly. Opal looked toward the television where another financial analyst discussed Mercer analytics. No, she admitted. And for the first time in weeks, she looked genuinely exhausted again. Not broken, just tired. Tired of defending her reality. Tired of explaining pain. Tired of proving she existed. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Sabrina Vale sat inside a luxury PR office watching her own strategy unfold perfectly. A media consultant scrolled through engagement metrics on a tablet. Public sympathy is leaning toward Julian now, he explained, especially after the emotional instability angle. Sabrina nodded slowly. Good. That was exactly what she wanted. She adjusted the sleeve of her cream blazer carefully. What about Opal? The consultant smirked. She's being framed as reactive and emotionally volatile, which honestly wasn't difficult. Sabrina looked toward the city skyline silently. She should have felt relieved. Instead, anxiety coiled tighter in her stomach every hour, because Julian was unraveling, and unstable, powerful men were dangerous, especially when cornered. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Julian. She answered immediately. What you spoke to reporters? Sabrina rolled her eyes. Relax. You promised discretion, and you promised your ex-wife signed everything. The silence on the other end said enough. Sabrina stood and walked toward the window. You told me she was emotionally dependent on you. She was. No, Sabrina corrected coldly. She was loyal. That's different. Julian's breathing sharpened slightly. I need you focused right now. Focused on what's saving your company or saving your ego. You think this is funny? No, Sabrina whispered. I think this is what happens when men confuse admiration with ownership. Then she hung up. Because deep down, Sabrina understood something Opal was only beginning to realize. Julian Mercer never truly saw women as equals emotionally, only extensions of his needs. And eventually, men like that betrayed everyone. Camille Brooks arrived at Opal's apartment just after sunset, carrying 3 thick folders and the expression of someone preparing for war. We've got more problems, she announced immediately. Harper muttered from the kitchen. At this point, that's basically your catchphrase. Camille ignored her and spread documents across the dining table. Forensic review confirmed your authorship patterns. Opal blinked slowly. So it's real? Oh, it's very real. Camille sat down heavily. But Sabrina and Julian are trying to shift public narrative before legal findings become official. Opal looked down at the articles again. I noticed. Camille's expression sharpened. No. You noticed gossip. I'm talking about something worse. She opened one folder. Financial transfers. Shell accounts. Internal communications. Opal frowned. What is this evidence that Sabrina knowingly participated in concealing ownership vulnerabilities during acquisition negotiations? Harper looked up sharply. So she knew? Camille nodded once. She absolutely knew.
A strange silence filled the apartment, because suddenly this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was coordinated deception. Opal sat down slowly. She looked me in the eyes at that dinner table. Camille's voice softened slightly. Women like Sabrina survive by aligning themselves with powerful men until the power shifts. Opal swallowed hard. And now she's trying to make sure Julian collapses alone. That realization hurt unexpectedly. Not because Opal cared about Sabrina, because betrayal was spreading outward now, like poison touching everyone involved. Camille slid another paper toward Opal. There's more. Opal scanned the page. Private communications. Internal discussions. One message highlighted in yellow. If Opal ever challenges ownership history, we discredit emotionally before legally. Her stomach dropped. Harper cursed softly under her breath. Opal reread the sentence twice. Emotionally before legally. Not just dismissal. Strategy. Planned character destruction. Suddenly, every headline felt different. Not random cruelty. Engineered narrative. Her chest tightened painfully. They were preparing for this. Camille nodded. Looks like Julian's team anticipated possible exposure years ago. The room became very quiet. Opal stared at the papers while memories resurfaced violently. Julian calling her emotional whenever she questioned him. Evelyn telling relatives Opal was fragile lately. Sabrina subtly framing her as unstable during dinners. Not accidental. Conditioning. Slow reputation erosion designed to weaken credibility later. Opal stood abruptly and walked toward the window. Snow fell softly across Manhattan again. Beautiful from a distance. Cold up close. I feel stupid, she whispered. Harper immediately shook her head, no. Yes, Opal said sharply. How did I not see this happening? Camille answered calmly from behind her. Because emotionally abusive people don't destroy you all at once. She paused. They train you to distrust yourself slowly. The truth of that nearly brought Opal to tears, because she remembered every moment she questioned her instincts instead of Julian's behavior. Every time she apologized for reacting to disrespect. Every time she convinced herself loneliness inside marriage was normal. Her phone buzzed suddenly again. Unknown number. Opal almost ignored it, then answered cautiously. Hello? A woman's voice responded quietly. Mrs. Black, my name is Lydia Warren. I worked in investor relations at Mercer Analytics 3 years ago. Opal frowned. Okay. I resigned because of how they talked about you internally. The apartment went still. Lydia continued nervously. They used to joke that you were emotionally attached enough never to challenge anything publicly. Opal closed her eyes slowly. Of course they did. Because kindness became weakness in rooms full of predators. Lydia's voice trembled slightly. I'm sorry. I should have spoken sooner. After the call ended, Opal remained motionless near the window. Harper approached carefully. What did she say? Opal laughed softly. Not happily, brokenly. She said they knew I loved him enough to stay quiet. Camille's jaw tightened. That's exactly why this matters. Opal looked down at the city below. For years, she thought survival meant enduring pain gracefully. Now she understood something different. Silence did not protect her dignity. It protected the people hurting her. Camille gathered the folders slowly. I'm filing tomorrow morning. Opal turned back. What happens then? Camille's eyes hardened. Then Julian Mercer and Sabrina Vale stopped controlling the story. The room fell silent again. But this time, the silence felt different. Not helpless. Not wounded. Dangerous. Because for the first time since this nightmare began,
Opal no longer wanted to disappear quietly. She wanted the truth seen clearly. And somewhere across Manhattan, powerful people were beginning to realize something terrifying. The woman they spent years dismissing had finally stopped apologizing for existing. The boardroom at Mercer Analytics had been designed to intimidate. 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows. A table long enough to separate power from consequence physically. For years, Opal Black would have walked into a room like this feeling small. Today, she walked in feeling awake. Every conversation stopped the moment she entered beside Camille Brooks. Executives looked nervous. Attorneys looked exhausted. Investors looked angry. And Julian Mercer looked like a man watching the final pieces of his carefully constructed identity collapse in real time. Sabrina Vale sat several seats away from him now, not beside him, not touching him. Distance had appeared between them overnight like a visible crack. Interesting, Opal thought. People loyal to power rarely stayed loyal to ruin. Daniel Reed stood near the windows reviewing documents, while corporate counsel whispered around him urgently. When he noticed Opal, he nodded respectfully. Not politely, respectfully. The difference nearly broke her heart. Because after 15 years of invisibility, basic acknowledgement felt overwhelming. Mrs. Black Daniel greeted calmly. "Thank you for coming." Mrs. Black, not Julian's wife, not emotional liability, not ex-wife, her own identity. Opal sat quietly across from Julian. He looked terrible, not physically destroyed, emotionally hollowed out, like sleep had abandoned him days ago. For a brief, dangerous second, pity flickered inside her chest. Then she remembered the Crescent Hotel, the family dinner, the years of erasure, and the pity disappeared. Danielle began without ceremony. After forensic review and internal investigation, several findings are now clear. Silence spread across the room instantly. One attorney adjusted his glasses nervously. Daniel continued. Mercer Analytics' foundational operational infrastructure was significantly developed by Opal Black during the company's formation stage. No one interrupted, because truth sounded heavier when spoken officially. Danielle looked toward Opal directly. Furthermore, internal records suggest her contributions were knowingly minimized over time. Julian finally spoke sharply. That interpretation is biased. Camille answered instantly. The documentation speaks for itself. Julian's jaw tightened. Opal watched him carefully. For years, he dominated rooms effortlessly. Now every sentence sounded defensive, smaller. Fear changed powerful men quickly. Daniel placed another folder onto the table. The acquisition cannot proceed under existing ownership structures. A board member cursed quietly under his breath. Another rubbed her temples in frustration. Hundreds of millions hung in the air around them like smoke. Julian leaned forward. So, what exactly are you proposing? Daniel turned toward Opal calmly. A direct negotiation. The room shifted. Even Julian looked startled. Daniel continued carefully. Our analysts believe the operational architecture retains enormous value, independent of Mercer Analytics' current executive structure, meaning they no longer trusted Julian, but they trusted Opal's work. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. Julian stared at Daniel in disbelief. You're serious? Yes. Daniel folded his hands. We are prepared to discuss a direct licensing partnership with Opal Black. The room exploded instantly. What? You can't bypass the company. This is insane. Julian stood abruptly. You're offering her the deal. Her. Still unable to separate Opal from emotional diminishment. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. I'm offering the architect behind the infrastructure a partnership. The words landed like thunder. Architect, not helper, not supportive wife. Architect. Opal sat completely still, while something painful expanded inside her chest. Recognition, finally. Publicly. The thing she begged for emotionally years ago now arrived through legal catastrophe instead. Funny how often women had to bleed publicly before people admitted they were brilliant. Julian laughed once. Cold. Disbelieving. She doesn't know how to run a company. Opal looked at him slowly. Neither did you when we started. Silence. Several executives avoided eye contact immediately. Because everyone inside that room knew the truth now. Miles Bennett finally spoke from the far end of the table. She built more of this place than most people realize. Julian turned sharply. You too. Miles looked exhausted. No, Julian. Just finally honest. That hurt him visibly. Because betrayal felt unbearable to people who normalized betraying others first. Sabrina suddenly spoke carefully. If this proceeds publicly, Mercer Analytics may not survive investor fallout. Interesting. Not we, not our company. Mercer Analytics. Distance again. Julian noticed too. His expression darkened. Daniel remained calm. That depends entirely on how responsibly this is handled moving forward. Then he looked toward Opal, which brings us to you. The room quieted instantly again. Daniel stepped closer to the table. You currently possess enough leverage to create catastrophic legal exposure, if you choose. Opal stayed silent, because he wasn't wrong. Daniel continued. You could pursue damages aggressively, freeze operational transitions, potentially destroy this acquisition entirely. Julian watched her carefully now, not arrogantly, fearfully. And that terrified him most of all, because Julian Mercer built his entire identity around being the powerful one in every room. Now power sat quietly across from him, wearing black and speaking softly. Danielle asked carefully, What do you want, Opal? The question lingered heavily. Everyone watched her. Executives, lawyers, investors. The same kinds of people who spent years treating her like decorative background beside Julian. Now suddenly, her answer mattered most. Opal looked around the boardroom slowly, then toward the skyline beyond the windows. And unexpectedly, she felt tired. Not weak, just tired of destruction. Tired of surviving rooms where people only respected cruelty. Finally, she spoke quietly. I don't want revenge. Julian looked genuinely shocked. Camille stayed perfectly still beside her. Opal continued. I want acknowledgement, silence. I want the truth corrected publicly. Danielle nodded slowly. That's reasonable. Julian stared at her in disbelief. That's it. Opal turned toward him. No, she said softly. I also want my life back. Something inside Julian visibly cracked then. Not his company, him. Because suddenly he understood something devastating. Even after all this pain, Opal still wasn't trying to destroy him, and somehow that made his behavior look even uglier. Daniel sat back down. We're prepared to structure a new agreement recognizing Opal Black as foundational co-architect with direct compensation, licensing equity, and future operational partnership opportunities. Board members exchanged stunned looks. One executive finally asked carefully, and Julian Daniel answered bluntly. That depends on whether shareholders still trust his leadership after intentional disclosure failures. Brutal, but fair. Julian looked hollow now. For years, he believed success made him untouchable. Now the same world that worshipped him professionally was recalculating his value in real time. Sabrina lowered her eyes quietly. She already knew what happened next. Corporate America forgave arrogance. It rarely forgave liability. Camille leaned toward Opal softly. You don't have to protect him anymore. The words hit deep.
because protection had become instinctive for her. Protect Julian's image. Protect Julian's stress levels. Protect Julian's ego. Protect Julian from consequences, even while nobody protected her. Opal looked at Julian carefully one final time. The man she once loved more than herself now looked smaller somehow. Not because he lost money, because truth stripped away the myth around him, and without the myth, he was just a man who betrayed the person most loyal to him. Danielle interrupted the silence gently. There's one more matter. Everyone looked toward him. We intend to publicly correct the company origin narrative. Opal blinked slowly. Danielle's voice remained calm. Your contributions will be formally recognized. That almost destroyed her emotionally. Not because she needed fame.
Because for years, she genuinely believed she deserved to disappear quietly. Tears burned behind her eyes suddenly. She looked away quickly before anyone noticed. But Julian noticed. Of course he did. And the tragedy in his face became unbearable for a moment. Because too late, far too late, he finally understood what she had been begging for all along. Not worship, not dependence, respect, real respect. The meeting adjourned slowly afterward. Executives scattered into whispered conversations. Lawyers gathered papers rapidly. Sabrina left first without speaking to Julian. Interesting again. Opal stood near the windows, gathering herself quietly, when Julian approached behind her. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then finally he whispered, "You could destroy me right now." Opal looked out over Manhattan. Yes. Julian swallowed hard. Why aren't you... She turned toward him slowly. And for the first time in years, Julian saw no fear in her eyes at all. Only exhaustion and clarity. Because becoming cruel like you would cost me more than revenge is worth. Julian looked like someone had hit him. Good. Some truths deserved impact. 3 months later, Opal Black no longer woke up with anxiety sitting on her chest. That alone felt miraculous. Morning sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of her new office, while Manhattan slowly came alive outside massive windows overlooking the river. The sign near reception still felt surreal every time she saw it. Black Systems Consulting. Her name, not hidden behind someone else's. Not attached as an afterthought beneath a husband's accomplishments. Hers. The first few weeks after the boardroom reckoning had been chaos. Financial media exploded when Mercer Analytics publicly amended its founding narrative. Articles shifted overnight. From ex-wife to co-creator. The woman behind Mercer Analytics. How Opal Black was erased from a billion-dollar story. Suddenly people wanted interviews, podcasts, magazine features, speaking engagements. But Opal declined most of them. Not because she was ashamed anymore, because she had spent enough of her life performing survival publicly. Now she wanted peace. Real peace. Camille Brooks entered the office carrying coffee and a stack of finalized contracts. You know, she said casually, most people would have burned Julian Mercer to the ground completely. Opal smiled faintly while reviewing licensing agreements. I know. And honestly, you had every legal right to. Opal leaned back slowly. Outside the windows, snow had finally melted from Manhattan streets. Spring was arriving, quietly, the same way healing did. I spent too many years letting his choices define my emotional life, Opal said softly. I didn't want revenge becoming another version of that. Camille studied her carefully. You're stronger than most people I know. Opal almost laughed. No, I was just tired of becoming someone smaller every time he hurt me. That was the real truth. Revenge tempted her at first. Not destruction exactly, but humiliation. The desire
to make Julian feel the same helplessness he forced onto her for years. But eventually, she realized something important. Pain did not become justice simply because it changed direction. So instead of destroying Mercer Analytics completely, Opal negotiated, carefully, strategically. She retained recognition rights, licensing equity, and long-term ownership compensation connected to the foundational infrastructure. Enough to secure financial independence permanently. Enough to ensure history could never erase her again, but not enough to destroy hundreds of innocent employees caught in the fallout. That decision shocked everyone, especially Julian, especially Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn actually called Opal personally 2 weeks after the settlement finalized. "You're making a mistake," Evelyn had warned coldly over the phone. "Mercy makes women weak." Opal remembered smiling quietly afterward. Because women like Evelyn confused cruelty with strength. And Opal finally understood the difference now. Real strength required restraint. Real strength required boundaries. Real strength meant refusing to become the same kind of person who hurt you. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant leaned inside. "Your 11 o'clock is here." Opal nodded. "Send her in." A nervous-looking woman in her late 30s stepped inside moments later, holding a folder tightly against her chest. "Hi," she said awkwardly. "I'm Rachel." Opal stood warmly. "Nice to meet you." Rachel sat carefully. "I almost cancelled this meeting 3 times. Opal smiled gently, while Rachel laughed shakily. "Because I haven't worked in 6 years." That sentence hit Opal harder than expected, because she remembered exactly what it felt like to believe your professional identity had disappeared completely. Rachel looked embarrassed. "My ex-husband handled everything financially. Then after the divorce," her voice cracked slightly, "I realized I didn't even know how to start over." Opal stayed quiet, listening, really listening, something Julian never learned how to do. Rachel looked down at her hands. "I saw your interview." Opal frowned slightly. "I barely gave one interview." "That's the one I saw." The interview. The only major public appearance Opal agreed to after the settlement. The host asked her what lesson she learned from losing her marriage publicly. And Opal answered honestly. "A woman becoming smaller for love is not romantic. It's tragic." Apparently the clip went viral. Rachel swallowed hard. "When you said that, I felt like someone finally explained my entire marriage." Emotion rose unexpectedly inside Opal's chest, because this was what mattered. Not headlines, not revenge. This. Helping women remember they existed outside survival. Over the following weeks, Opal quietly built something new alongside her consulting work. A foundation, not flashy, not performative. Just practical support for women rebuilding careers after emotional or financial dependency. Scholarships, career placement assistance, professional mentoring, therapy grants. Small things that became enormous when someone's life collapsed. Harper called it Opal's revenge era. Opal disagreed. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. Meanwhile, Julian Mercer disappeared slowly from public celebration. He technically remained part of Mercer Analytics during restructuring phases, but the mythology around him was gone now. And powerful men often suffered more from losing admiration than losing money. Sabrina Vale vanished first. No dramatic goodbye. No public loyalty. She simply exited quietly once investors began distancing themselves from Julian. Opal heard rumors Sabrina accepted another executive position in California. Interesting. The woman who once looked untouchable beside Julian disappeared the moment his power stopped protecting her socially. Poetic in a way. One rainy evening after work, Opal stopped outside a bookstore carrying flowers and nearly froze. Because across the street, Julian stood watching her, not hidden, not dramatic, just standing quietly beneath grey skies with his hands inside his coat pockets. He looked thinner now, more human. The sharp confidence that once filled every room around him had softened into something quieter. Sadness, maybe. Regret. Opal crossed the street slowly. Neither spoke at first. Traffic moved around them while rain tapped softly against umbrellas nearby. Finally, Julian looked toward the office building behind her. "You really built a whole new life." The words sounded fragile, like he still couldn't quite believe it. Opal glanced toward the glowing office windows upstairs. "Yes?" Julian swallowed slowly. "I heard about the foundation too." She nodded once. "You're helping strangers with money you could have used destroying me." Opal studied him carefully. "You still think everything is about you?" That hurt him visibly. "Good. Because some truths deserve to remain sharp." Julian looked away briefly. "I lost almost everything." Opal stayed silent. Not cold, just honest. Julian laughed softly beneath the rain. "The crazy part is..." He shook his head slightly. "I spent years thinking you needed me to survive." Opal felt something unexpected then, not anger, grief. Because she remembered believing that too. Remembered shaping her entire existence around keeping one man emotionally comfortable enough not to leave her. How terrifying. How common. "You know what I realized?" Julian asked quietly. Opal waited. "I built my entire identity around being admired." He looked at her finally. "And you were the only person who actually loved me before any of it." The sadness in his voice almost broke her heart. Almost. But healing changes people. And Opal had finally healed enough to stop confusing empathy with obligation. "You should go home, Julian." His eyes filled with something painful. "There's no home anymore." The words lingered heavily between them. Because they were true for both of them. The marriage was dead. The illusion was dead. The old versions of themselves were dead too. And somehow, that was necessary. Julian nodded slowly. Before leaving, he looked at her one final time. "You know what scares me most?" Opal stayed quiet. "You're happier without me." For years, Julian believed love meant being needed desperately. He never understood that healthy love allowed people to remain whole individually. Opal watched him disappear into the rain, and instead of pain, she felt peace, real peace, the kind that arrives only after surviving the thing you once believed would destroy you. 2 years later, Opal Black stood backstage inside a packed auditorium in Chicago, listening to hundreds of women applaud someone else's story. Soon, they would hear hers. A young event coordinator rushed past holding cue cards, while stage lights washed the curtains gold. "You're on in 3 minutes," she whispered excitedly. Opal smiled softly. "Thank you." The coordinator hesitated awkwardly. "I just wanted to say..." Her eyes became emotional suddenly. "Your story helped my mom leave a really bad marriage." The words landed gently inside Opal's chest. Even now, she still struggled to understand the reach of what happened after Mercer Analytics collapsed publicly. Not the scandal, the honesty afterward. Because once Opal finally spoke openly about emotional erasure, thousands of women recognized themselves inside her story immediately. Women who sacrificed careers. Women who became emotionally invisible. Women taught that loyalty meant enduring disrespect silently. Opal used to think survival was private. Now she understood healing could become collective too. The applause outside grew louder. Harper adjusted Opal's blazer affectionately. "You nervous a little?" Harper smirked. "Good. Means you still care." That was true.
Despite everything she survived, Opal never became cold. And she was proud of that now. Pain had changed her. But it had not poisoned her. The host stepped backstage smiling brightly. "They're ready for you." As Opal walked toward the stage entrance, she caught sight of herself briefly in a reflective glass panel. Calm eyes. Confident posture. No fear. Not because life became painless. Because she finally trusted herself enough not to disappear inside someone else again. The auditorium erupted into applause as she stepped onto the stage. Hundreds of women stood immediately, some crying already, some smiling, some simply looking relieved to see someone who survived publicly and remained soft afterward. That part mattered to Opal most. Softness was not weakness. She wished more women understood that earlier. The host hugged her quickly before stepping aside, and suddenly the enormous stage belonged entirely to Opal Black. Not Julian Mercer's wife, not Mercer Analytics' forgotten architect, just Opal. The applause slowly faded. Opal stepped toward the microphone. For a second she said nothing. Then quietly, "2 years ago I thought losing my marriage was the worst thing that could happen to me." Silence filled the auditorium instantly. Opal smiled faintly. "I was wrong." A few soft laughs spread through the crowd. "The worst thing that happened to me was losing myself long before the marriage ended." That one hit deeply. She could feel it, the recognition moving through the room. Opal continued slowly. "I spent 15 years believing love meant sacrifice without limits." She paused. "And eventually, I became so focused on supporting someone else's dreams that I abandoned my own existence entirely." Women in the audience nodded silently, some crying already. Opal understood those tears. Because grief often arrived years after survival ended. For a long time, she continued, "I thought kindness meant staying quiet, forgiving quickly, taking less space emotionally." Her voice softened. But women are not born to become background characters in their own lives. Applause erupted loudly. Opal looked across the crowd carefully. Different ages, different backgrounds, same exhaustion behind many eyes. She recognized it immediately now. The exhaustion of constantly shrinking yourself to remain lovable. Then someone near the front raised a hand unexpectedly. "Do you still love him?" The room became very still. A younger Opal would have panicked at such a personal question publicly. Now she simply thought carefully before answering honestly. "No." Silence. Then Opal smiled softly. "But I loved him for a very long time, and I don't think that makes me weak." A woman in the second row began crying harder. Opal continued gently. "The truth is, people talk a lot about leaving toxic relationships." She paused. "But nobody talks enough about what happens after." The room stayed silent. Because healing is not cinematic. That line made several women laugh softly through tears. There's no magical morning where you suddenly feel whole again. Healing is ordinary. Opal smiled. It's buying furniture for an apartment alone, learning to eat dinner without anxiety, realizing silence can feel peaceful instead of lonely. The audience applauded again. Opal looked upward briefly toward the stage lights. For years, she feared becoming bitter. That fear haunted her more than divorce itself. But bitterness required staying emotionally trapped inside old pain forever. And Opal finally let go. Not because Julian deserved forgiveness, because she deserved freedom. After the event ended, women lined up for nearly an hour just to speak with her. Some shared stories quietly. Others simply hugged her crying. One woman whispered, "You made me feel visible again." That nearly broke Opal emotionally. Because visibility was all she ever wanted too. Eventually the crowd thinned. The auditorium emptied slowly. Harper and Camille waited near the exit, discussing flights back to New York when Opal noticed someone standing near the back row alone. Julian. For a moment time folded strangely, not painfully, just strangely. He looked different now. Simpler, less polished. The sharp corporate arrogance gone completely. Julian walked toward her slowly once the room emptied. Neither spoke immediately. Then finally he said quietly, "You were incredible." Opal smiled politely. "Thank you." Julian glanced around the nearly empty auditorium. "They love you." Opal looked at the women still lingering nearby. "No," she corrected gently. "They recognize themselves." Julian nodded slowly. For a few seconds, neither knew what else to say. Then, Julian laughed softly under his breath. "You know what's funny?" Opal waited. "I spent years thinking success made me powerful." She remembered that version of him vividly. The man addicted to admiration, to importance, to control. And now she asked quietly. Julian looked directly at her. "And now I think integrity does." The honesty in his voice felt real. Finally. Too late. But real. Opal studied him carefully. She no longer saw the man who destroyed her life, nor the man she once worshipped emotionally, just a flawed human being who lost himself chasing significance. And strangely, that no longer hurt. Julian shoved his hands into his coat pockets awkwardly. "I'm glad you kept fighting." Opal smiled faintly. "That's the thing." He frowned slightly. "But I stopped fighting for you." Her eyes softened. "And started fighting for myself." Julian looked down briefly. Pain crossed his face quietly. But this time, Opal did not rush to fix it. That was healing too. Understanding someone else's sadness no longer required sacrificing yourself emotionally. Julian nodded once. Then, after a long pause, "You know, when you took that storage box during the divorce, I thought you were holding on to memories." Opal laughed softly. "I know. What were you really holding on to?" For years she might have answered differently. The documents, the proof, the company. But now she finally understood the truth herself. Opal looked toward the bright stage lights one last time before answering. "Myself." Silence settled between them peacefully. No rage left, no begging, no emotional chains. Just two people standing in the aftermath of choices that changed them forever. Julian smiled sadly, then nodded once and walked away quietly. And this time, Opal did not watch him leave with grief. Only gratitude that she survived becoming invisible long enough to finally be seen.